The birth of a nation is never a clean affair. It is a story written in blood, ambition, and myth. The founding of Laos, the kingdom of Lanzang, is no different. But the official histories, with their focus on conquering kings, tell only half the tale. The other half, the more enduring half, was written by women. They were not merely consorts or footnotes. They were the architects of culture, the arbiters of faith, and the ruthless players in a game of thrones that shaped a kingdom for centuries. This is their story. If you're ready for a tale of warrior queens, bulletproof priestesses, and the secret history they don't teach you in school, you've come to the right place. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more incredible stories like this one. The man who would be King, Fa Num, began his journey not as a conqueror, but as an exile. A Lao prince born in 1316, he was banished from his home of Muang Sua as a boy, cast out due to a shaman's dark omen. He found refuge in the heart of a regional superpower, the Khmer Empire at Angkor. There, in the shadow of the world's most magnificent temples, he was educated not just as a warrior, but as a Buddhist, absorbing the culture and political sophistication of a civilization at its zenith. But his return to power was not his alone to command. It was a prize secured through a strategic marriage to the Khmer princess Keo Kang Ya. This union was no simple love match. It was a political masterstroke that gave Fa Num the one thing he lacked: an army. With the blessing of his royal father-in-law, he marched north in the mid-14th century at the head of a 10,000-strong Khmer force, a host granted to him to reclaim and unify the fractured Lao principalities. In 1353, his conquest complete, Fa Num established the Kingdom of Lanzang Homkao, the Kingdom of a Million Elephants and a White Parasol. The name itself tells a dual story. The Million Elephants were a brutal declaration of military might, a symbol of the raw power that had forged the state through force of arms. A symbol of the raw power that had forged the state through force of arms. The White Parasol, however, was a symbol of sophisticated Buddhist-backed royalty, an idea imported directly from the Khmer court. While Fa Num provided the elephants, it was his queen who provided the parasol. Queen Keo Kang Ya was not a passive observer in her husband's new kingdom. She was its chief cultural architect. She is explicitly credited with introducing Theravada Buddhism as the state religion, a move that would define Lao identity for all time. This was a deliberate act of cultural and political engineering. To consecrate this new spiritual order, her father, the Khmer king, sent a sacred golden Buddha image, the Phra Bang, to the new capital. More than a mere gift, the Phra Bang became the Palladium of Lanzang, the ultimate spiritual protector of the realm, its presence legitimizing the monarchy and unifying the people under a single, powerful faith. The military campaign of Fa Num was swift and violent, a conquest of territory. Yet the cultural conquest led by Queen Keo Kang Ya proved far more profound and lasting. While her husband's armies subdued rival warlords, her introduction of a unifying state religion provided the ideological cement that would bind the disparate Lao Muang together. Her influence outlasted Fa Num's wars and became the very bedrock of a national identity. The forging of Laos was as much an act of spiritual and cultural statecraft wielded by a shrewd queen as it was a series of battlefield victories won by a warrior king. Prosperity is fleeting. After its powerful founding, the Kingdom of Lanzang enjoyed a period of stability before descending into a century of chaos. The throne became a revolving door of weak and short-lived monarchs. Between 1416 and 1438 alone, no fewer than 7 kings came and went, a testament to a kingdom tearing itself apart from the inside. In this bloody power vacuum, a woman stepped out from the shadows to seize control. Known to history as Mahathavi, the Great Queen, she would rule not as a monarch in her own right, but as the ruthless power behind a series of puppet kings whom she made and unmade at will. The Lao chronicles, written by men in later, more stable times, paint her as a malign crone, an unnatural usurper who was the sole cause of the kingdom's turmoil. They record that she orchestrated the murder of King That after he had reigned for a mere 10 months and continued her bloody manipulation of the throne for nearly a decade. Her very identity is shrouded in mystery and political spin. Some sources claim she was Nang Keo Phimfa, the eldest daughter of the great king Samsenathai, which would have given her a legitimate, though culturally unsanctioned, claim to power. Others suggest she was the aged widow of the kingdom's founder, Fan Gum, a version that connects her directly to the kingdom's foundational mythos. Regardless of her origins, her power was undeniable. For a woman to hold such sway for so long in a deeply patriarchal court, she must have been a political operator of terrifying skill, commanding a powerful faction of nobles and officials. The narrative of a singular evil woman single-handedly causing a kingdom's decline is a convenient fiction. It papers over the deeper systemic rot, flawed succession laws that invited bloody disputes, rival court factions vying for influence, and the constant pressure from neighboring powers like Ayutthaya and Lana, who were always eager to exploit any sign of weakness in Lanzang. Mahadevi was not the cause of the chaos. She was a product of it, and she played the deadly game better than any man of her time. Her end, however, was as brutal as her alleged reign. The chronicles state that the nobility and the people, finally pushed too far, rose up in a rage. They seized the great queen and her young husband, whom she had married and allegedly sought to place on the throne, dragged them to the riverbank, tied them to rocks, and left them to be slowly consumed by the rising water, a gruesome death for a woman who dared to rule, whom she had married and allegedly sought to place on the throne, dragged them to the riverbank, tied them to rocks, and left them to be slowly consumed by the rising water, a gruesome death for a woman who dared to rule. This horrific end serves a clear political purpose in the historical record. It is a cautionary tale, a violent warning against female ambition, and a legitimization of the male-led dynasty that followed and restored order. The story of Mahadevi is a testament not only to her own formidable will, but to the existential threat an intelligent, independent woman posed to the established structures of power. It is a cautionary tale, a violent warning against female ambition and a legitimization of the male-led dynasty that followed and restored order. The story of Mahadevi is a testament not only to her own formidable will, but to the existential threat an intelligent, independent woman posed to the established structures of power. After the blood-soaked interregnum of Mahadevi, Lanzang eventually found its footing, entering a 57-year period of peace and prosperity under King Surinya Vongsa. This era is remembered as the kingdom's golden age, a time of cultural flourishing and economic stability. But this golden age was not forged in the royal court of Vientiane alone. It was spun from silk threads in villages across the kingdom, managed in bustling local markets, and secured by the labor of countless unnamed women, who formed the true backbone of Lanzang's power. The kingdom's wealth was derived from its strategic position at the center of Southeast Asia's overland trade routes, linking the empires of China and Burma with the kingdoms of Siam and Vietnam. The lifeblood of this trade was not rice or timber, which were difficult to transport, but high-value portable goods. It was here that the women of Lanzang dominated. They were masters of craftsmanship, renowned for their skill in producing exquisite silk textiles and intricate gold and silver work. These were not mere handicrafts. They were the engine of the state's economy, the luxury goods that funded the king's court and maintained the peace. Across Southeast Asia, women traditionally held dominion over household finances and local commerce, and Laos was no exception. While the king and his male courtiers concerned themselves with high politics and diplomacy, it was the women who ran the microeconomies of the villages, who controlled the markets, and who managed the production of the very goods that gave the kingdom its wealth. This economic power was the foundation upon which the celebrated Golden Age was built. The strength of Lao women was not confined to the marketplace. While historical records are sparse, a persistent theme in modern Lao fiction is that of the warrior woman, a genre believed by some to have its origins in the historical reality of women taking up arms and joining the Lanzang armies to defend their homes during the frequent invasions that marked the kingdom's history. This tradition points to a deep cultural understanding of female strength and resilience that extended from the loom to the battlefield. The golden age of King Surya was not his creation alone. It rested on the silent, unrecorded economic power and unwavering fortitude of the women of his kingdom. Empires wrought from the head down. The golden age of Lanzang ended not with a bang, but with a succession crisis that exposed the kingdom's fatal flaw. The death of a single king without an heir unleashed a century of civil war, inviting the kingdom's rapacious neighbors, Siam and Vietnam, to feast on the corpse. For the women of Laos, this was the beginning of a long nightmare of invasion, enslavement, and displacement, a period where their bodies and their homelands became the spoils of war in a brutal contest between regional titans. The stability of King Suryavongsa's long reign concealed a fatal weakness. When he died in 1694, he left no clear heir, having years earlier executed his only son for the crime of adultery. This single act of patriarchal justice doomed the entire nation. The power vacuum he left behind was immediately filled by ambitious nobles and rival claimants to the throne, shattering the unified kingdom. By 1707, the great kingdom of Lanzang was no more. In its place stood three smaller, weaker, and bitterly rivalrous kingdoms, Luang Prabang in the north, Vientiane in the center, and Champasak in the south. This division was a catastrophic blow to Lao dominance in the region. The internecine warfare that followed was a formal invitation to their powerful neighbors. Siam and Vietnam, long held at bay by a unified Lanzang, now intervened directly, propping up their preferred candidates for each of the three thrones and turning the Lao kingdoms against one another. The royal women of the fractured courts, the queens and princesses of Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak, were reduced to political pawns in this deadly game. Their marriages were no longer tools of internal alliance building but instruments of foreign policy, sealing tributary relationships with either Bangkok or Hue. By the late 18th century, the contest was over. Following a decisive war in 1778-79, Siamese armies established hegemony over all three Lao states. The kings of Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak became vassals of Siam. They were forced to pay tribute, their appointments to the throne had to be approved in Bangkok, and Siamese commissioners were installed in their courts to oversee their affairs. The era of Lao independence was over. The failure to establish a clear, undisputed line of succession, the very same systemic flaw that the great Queen Mahadevi had exploited centuries before, had become the kingdom's ultimate undoing. Hope can be a dangerous thing. For the subjugated Lao, it came in the form of Choua Thao, the last king of Vientiane. Installed by the Siamese, he was a charismatic and capable ruler who dreamed of shaking off the yoke of vassalage and reuniting the lands of Lanzang. In 1826, acting on a disastrously false rumor that the British were preparing to invade Siam, he saw his chance and launched a rebellion. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that would bring annihilation upon his people. Anuvong's armies initially stormed across the Korat Plateau, advancing to within 3 days' march of Bangkok itself. His primary goal was to liberate the tens of thousands of ethnic Lao who had been forcibly resettled in the region by the Siamese in previous decades. But the Siamese response was swift and merciless. Their far superior forces drove the Lao armies back, and in 1827 they fell upon Vientiane. The city was not merely captured, it was obliterated. The Siamese sacked the capital, leveling its temples and palaces until almost nothing remained standing but the lone temple of Wat Si Saket. The military defeat was followed by a demographic catastrophe. The Siamese armies conducted vast, systematic slave raids across central Laos, rounding up the population and marching them across the Mekong to populate the Korat Plateau. These were not abstract movements of people. They were brutal death marches where women, children, and the elderly were driven from their ancestral lands to serve new masters. Where women, children, and the elderly were driven from their ancestral lands to serve new masters. It is from the crucible of this brutal campaign that a Thai national hero was forged, Thao Suranari, or Lady Mo. Thao Suranari, or Lady Mo. According to the Thai national narrative, she was the wife of the deputy governor of Nakhon Ratchasima, who, after being taken captive along with other townspeople, rallied her fellow prisoners, who, after being taken captive along with other townspeople, rallied her fellow prisoners. In one version of the story, she plied the Lao guards with alcohol. In another, she requested knives to prepare food and then armed the male captives, who rose up and slaughtered their captors. In another, she requested knives to prepare food and then armed the male captives, who rose up and slaughtered their captors. This story, celebrated annually in Thailand, is a masterclass in the construction of national myth. From a Siamese perspective, Lady Mo is a patriot, a brave woman who defended her people. From a Siamese perspective, Lady Mo is a patriot, a brave woman who defended her people. But this triumphant narrative can only exist through the complete erasure of the Lao perspective. The prisoners she supposedly rallied were, in large part, Lao civilians, women and children, who had been captured and were being marched into slavery. The invaders were men fighting to liberate them. The invaders were men fighting to liberate them. The story of Thao Suranari weaponizes the suffering of Lao women, transforming their subjugation into a triumphant moment of Thai nationalism. The true, untold story of courage belongs not to the governor's wife, but to the thousands of unnamed Lao women who survived the destruction of their capital, endured the forced march into captivity, and then had to live under a new regime that celebrated their defeat as its own heroic founding myth. The 19th century saw the Lao people bled dry by their neighbors. Trapped in a vice between an expansionist Siam to the west and a powerful Vietnam to the east, the fractured Lao kingdoms faced total annihilation. Salvation, it seemed, came from an unexpected direction, the colonial power of France. But this salvation was a poisoned chalice. The French offered protection from one set of masters only to impose their own. For the women of Laos, especially those from the proud and independent highland tribes, this meant trading one form of oppression for another, sparking a new era of fierce and bloody resistance. By the late 19th century, the Lao kingdoms were on the brink of being completely absorbed by Siam. In a desperate bid to preserve what little remained of their sovereignty, the court of Luang Prabang appealed to France for protection. The French, eager to expand their Indo-Chinese empire and check Siamese power, readily agreed. Through a show of gunboat diplomacy at Bangkok and a series of coercive treaties, France forced Siam to cede all its territories east of the Mekong River in 1893. Subsequent agreements, culminating in the Franco-Siamese Treaty of 1907, finalized the modern border between Laos and Thailand, creating the political entity we know today. The French unified the three Lao kingdoms, Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak, into a single protectorate administered as a component of French Indochina. But French interest in Laos was minimal. Lacking a seaport and seen as little more than a strategic buffer state between their valuable holdings in Vietnam and British-influenced Siam, Laos became a colonial backwater. French rule was characterized by neglect and exploitation. They did little to develop the country's infrastructure or economy, instead imposing heavy taxes and demanding forced labor from the local population. To tighten their control, they established a state monopoly on the region's most lucrative cash crop, opium. Compounding the humiliation, the French employed a classic divide-and-rule strategy. They filled the lower ranks of the new colonial administration not with Lao, but with Vietnamese civil servants, deliberately fueling ethnic resentment and preventing the formation of a unified anti-colonial movement. For the Lao people, the French had not been liberators. They had simply replaced the Siamese commissioner with a French resident superior, swapping one set of chains for another. While the Laolum elite were largely co-opted by the French colonial system, the fiercest resistance to the new European masters came from the highlands. The ethnic minorities of the mountains, the Lao Theong and Lao Song, who had long resisted domination by the lowland kingdoms, were not about to submit to a new foreign power. Their defiance erupted in two major rebellions that shook the foundations of French control. The first was the Holy Man's Rebellion, which broke out on the Bolavan Plateau in southern Laos in 1901. It was a messianic uprising led by a charismatic leader from the Alak people named Ong Keo. Proclaiming himself a Pumi Baun, a prophesied holy man who would liberate the people, he rallied thousands of followers from various Lao Tiong groups. The rebellion was a direct response to the imposition of French taxes and the erosion of traditional authority. Women were a core part of this popular spiritual movement, which waged a guerrilla war against the French for nearly a decade. The colonial authorities responded with overwhelming force, and the rebellion was eventually crushed. In 1910, Ong Keo was treacherously assassinated by a French commissioner during supposed peace talks. Further north, a second major revolt erupted between 1918 and 1921. This was the War of the Insane, a name dripping with colonial condescension, guerre de fou in French, given to a massive uprising of the Hmong people. Led by the visionary Pache Vieux, the Hmong were driven to rebellion by the same grievances: oppressive French taxation, particularly on their main cash crop of opium, and the favoritism the French showed to the lowland Lao officials who acted as their intermediaries. These rebellions from the margins were a raw expression of defiance against a double oppression, first by the traditional Lao elite and now by their new French masters. They demonstrated that the true spirit of Lao independence burned brightest not in the royal courts, but in the remote mountain villages of its most marginalized peoples. The Hmong rebellion against the French was a desperate, asymmetric war. The rebels, armed with homemade flintlock rifles and ingenious cannons fashioned from hollowed-out tree trunks, faced a modern colonial army. Yet for a time, they were winning. Their victories were attributed not just to their guerrilla tactics and knowledge of the terrain, but to a source of power the French could neither comprehend nor counter: the spiritual authority of a young woman. Her name was Kao Mee, and she was the sister of the rebellion's leader, Pache Vieux. She was not a conventional military commander, but a warrior priestess. According to Hmong accounts, she went into battle carrying a simple white flag made of hemp cloth. Her followers believed with absolute conviction that this flag, and Kao Mee herself, possessed the divine power to deflect French bullets. This belief was rooted in her spiritual status. She was considered a righteous virgin, and it was this purity that granted her miraculous abilities and the protection of the heavens. The psychological impact of her presence was immense. For the Hmong fighters, it transformed a hopeless struggle into a divine crusade, inspiring them to acts of incredible bravery. For the French and their colonial troops, it was terrifying. As they advanced into the mountains, they faced an enemy who seemed immune to their weapons, an army led by a woman who could supposedly turn aside their bullets with a wave of a flag. This fusion of spiritual belief and armed resistance allowed the rebellion to spread across 40,000 square kilometers of Indochina, from northern Vietnam to Luang Prabang. Ultimately, faith alone could not overcome firepower. As World War I ended in Europe, France was able to divert reinforcements to Indochina, and their superior numbers and weaponry gradually overwhelmed the Hmong rebels. But the rebellion had been so fierce and so effective that it forced a concession from the colonial power. In 1920, the French granted the Hmong a measure of political autonomy within their territories, a direct result of the struggle led by Pa Che and his bulletproof sister. Kao Mee's story exemplifies a powerful form of female leadership, one based not on inherited status or political appointment, but on a spiritual charisma that could mobilize a people and challenge an empire. Independence, when it finally came, was not a sunrise, but the eerie calm before a hurricane. The departure of the French in 1954 left Laos a nominally neutral kingdom, but it was a pawn in a much larger game. The Cold War had come to Southeast Asia, and Laos became its secret battlefield. For nearly 2 decades, the country was torn apart by a brutal civil war, fueled by foreign superpowers and fought by Laotians on all sides. Overshadowing it all was a secret American air war of unprecedented ferocity, a rain of death that fell indiscriminately on soldiers and civilians, communists and royalists alike. In this crucible, new heroines were forged. Nurses who tended to a secret army, soldiers who fought for a communist revolution, and mothers who simply tried to keep their children alive under a sky of fire. The Geneva Accords of 1954 were supposed to guarantee Laos's neutrality, but the country's geography made that promise impossible to keep. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vital network of supply routes used by North Vietnam to support its war effort in the south, snaked through the dense jungles of eastern Laos. To sever this lifeline without officially invading, the United States launched one of the most devastating aerial bombardments in human history, a clandestine operation that became known as the Secret War. From 1964 to 1973, the U.S. Air Force flew approximately 600,000 bombing missions over Laos, dropping more than 2 million tons of ordnance on a country with which it was not officially at war. The scale is difficult to comprehend. It was the equivalent of a fully loaded B-52 dropping its payload every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 consecutive years. This relentless assault made Laos, a small landlocked nation of farmers, the most heavily bombed country per capita in the history of warfare. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 50,000 civilians were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were forced to flee their ancestral villages, becoming refugees in their own land. For the women on the ground, life became a subterranean hell. They moved their lives into caves and hand-dug tunnels, farming their fields only at night to avoid the American jets that hunted anything that moved during the day. This was a war against an entire population, a campaign of terror from the air that shattered the fabric of rural society. The story of women like Thuma Sishamphan, who as a child fled with her family to Vietnam to escape the bombing, only to return to a homeland still under aerial assault, gives a human face to the cold statistics of the air war. While the U.S. Air Force waged war from the sky, the Central Intelligence Agency fought a parallel war on the ground. In direct violation of the Geneva Accords, the CIA's Special Activities Division recruited, trained, and funded a massive clandestine army of some 30,000 Laotian hill tribesmen, primarily Hmong, to fight the communist Pathet Lao and their North Vietnamese allies. This secret army, led by the charismatic Hmong general Vang Pao, became the United States' primary anti-communist force in Laos. As the war intensified and casualties mounted, a critical need arose for medical personnel to patch up the wounded soldiers of this secret army. It was a need that would inadvertently spark a revolution in Hmong society. The CIA and its partners began recruiting Hmong women and girls to serve as nurses and healthcare workers. The proposal was met with fierce resistance from traditional Hmong clan leaders, who argued that it was improper for young, unmarried women to work in hospitals and care for male patients. The sheer desperation of the war effort, however, overrode these centuries-old cultural taboos. A pivotal figure in this transformation was Choua Thao. Recruited by an American aid program at the age of 13 because of her rare education and ability to speak English, she quickly proved to be an exceptional leader. By the age of 22, she was the head administrator of the main covert hospital at Sam Thong, the nerve center of the Secret War. Thao became a recruiter herself, flying by helicopter into remote mountain villages to persuade families to let their daughters join the nursing corps. These young women, some barely teenagers, underwent intensive 3-month training courses and were then thrown into the maelstrom, performing everything from surgery and pharmacy to delivering babies under the most brutal battlefield conditions. The Secret War, for all its horror, became an accidental catalyst for female emancipation within Hmong society. The crisis forced a patriarchal culture to recognize the capability and indispensability of its women. Choua Thao and her corps of young nurses were not just medics. They were pioneers, shattering cultural barriers and proving that women could be leaders in their nation's darkest hour. The Hmong women who served the CIA-backed army were not the only ones fighting for their vision of Laos. On the other side of the brutal civil war were the women of the Pathet Lao, the communist movement that, with the crucial support of North Vietnam, sought to overthrow the corrupt royal Lao government and build a new socialist state. Their motivations were a mix of fervent nationalism and communist ideology. They fought against what they saw as a puppet regime controlled by American imperialists and for a future of social equality. The Pathet Lao actively mobilized women into their cause through mass organizations like the Lao Women's Union, which was established in 1955 and became a key instrument for recruiting and indoctrinating women into the revolutionary struggle. Women served in a variety of roles within the Pathet Lao, from logistics and propaganda to armed combat. After their victory in 1975, the new communist government celebrated the image of the female revolutionary. This was most famously immortalized on a postage stamp issued that year, which depicted two Pathet Lao women fighters. Dressed in traditional sin skirts but armed with rifles, they stand proudly atop the wreckage of a downed American warplane, a potent symbol of nationalist defiance and female empowerment. The secret war thus produced two powerful competing images of the Lao woman warrior. There was the Hmong nurse like Choua Thao tending to the wounded of America's secret army, and the Pathet Lao guerrilla fighting to expel those same Americans from her country. Both were acting with immense courage, and both believed they were fighting for the future of their nation. The 1975 postage stamp was a masterful piece of propaganda by the victors, an attempt to seize the narrative of female patriotism for themselves and write the story of the women who fought on the other side out of history. The fall of the Royal Lao government in 1975 and the victory of the Pathet Lao did not end the suffering. For hundreds of thousands of Laotians, it marked the beginning of a new chapter of terror, exile, and a war that refused to die. The American bombs had stopped falling, but the land itself had been poisoned, sown with millions of unexploded munitions that would continue to reap a harvest of death and dismemberment for generations. In this new, haunted peace, the women of Laos would once again be called upon to lead, first, to guide their families out of the darkness, and then, to heal the very earth they walk on. For those who had sided with the Americans, the Pathet Lao victory was a death sentence. The new communist regime immediately began a campaign of retribution against its former enemies. Tens of thousands of soldiers and officials from the old Royal Lao government, along with their Hmong allies from the secret army, were rounded up and sent to brutal re-education camps. These were not schools, but forced labor camps deep in the jungle where prisoners were subjected to political indoctrination, starvation, and summary execution. Many who entered never returned. Faced with the threat of persecution and genocide, a massive exodus began. Between 1975 and 1995, more than 360,000 Lao and Hmong people fled their homeland, becoming refugees. With so many men killed in the war or imprisoned in the camps, the burden of escape fell heavily on the women. They became the leaders of their shattered families, guiding children and elderly parents on harrowing treks through the jungle, hiding from Pathet Lao patrols who had orders to shoot on sight. Their final obstacle was the Mekong River, a wide and dangerous barrier that they had to cross, often on makeshift rafts under the cover of darkness, to reach the relative safety of refugee camps in Thailand. The physical journey was only part of the ordeal. The women carried with them the deep psychological scars of war and flight, haunted by the memories of the atrocities they had witnessed. They had survived the war only to lose their homes, their husbands, and their country. Their long walk across the river was an act of profound courage and desperation, a flight for survival led by the mothers and daughters left behind. The war officially ended in 1975, but for the people of Laos, the killing never stopped. The American bombing campaign had left behind a deadly legacy. An estimated 80 million unexploded cluster munitions, known as bommies, littered the fields, forests, and villages of the country. These small tennis ball-sized explosives, of which up to 30% failed to detonate on impact, turned vast swathes of Laos into de facto minefields. For decades, this eternal harvest has continued to claim victims. More than 20,000 people have been killed or maimed by unexploded ordnance since the war's end, with children accounting for a staggering 40% of the casualties. The story of Thoma Sishamphan is tragically common. Having survived the bombing as a child, she lost her husband years later when he accidentally struck a buried bombie while digging a drainage ditch. In a patrilineal society, such accidents plunge families into poverty, with women left to fend for their children alone on land that is too dangerous to farm. Today, a new kind of army is fighting to reclaim this poisoned land, and women are on its front lines. These are the all-female demining teams, modern-day heroines who are waging a slow, painstaking war against the remnants of the old one. Organizations like the Mines Advisory Group have pioneered the use of all-female clearance teams, and as of 2025, women make up a remarkable 35% of the entire UXO clearance sector in Laos.